Hello and welcome back to Directly Current. I'm Max Patton, and this week I'm speaking with Mike Colias, a Wall Street Journal reporter based in Detroit who reports on the heart of the auto industry. But he spent the last several years writing an epic book called Inevitable: Inside the Messy, Unstoppable Transition to Electric Vehicles. It's all about what it says on the tin, and it focuses on some really interesting dynamics, like the epic ancient rivalry between General Motors and Ford as they race to make their own electric vehicles to compete with Tesla, as well as the inside story of how startups like Rivian were incubated, and of course the overseas miracles happening in China, the reluctance of Toyota and Japan to make EVs, and the disaster that has been post-Dieselgate Volkswagen in Europe. This is an amazing book. It has so much scale. I really recommend you read it, but our conversation today is just going to be a snippet of it. We're going to focus specifically on the U.S. manufacturing side of things, because here at the American EV Jobs Alliance, that's what we're all about. So please enjoy my conversation with Mike Colias. I want to say congratulations on publishing the book. Big accomplishment there, and culmination of many years of work. The first thing I wanted to talk about is that many people will hear about a book about electric vehicles and the EV transition and think about Tesla. And obviously Tesla comes up in the book. You see the mention of the way Herbert Diess at Volkswagen, then Jim Farley at CEO, reacts to Tesla, and Tesla looms large in every room. But I think you specifically put somewhere that it's not a book about Tesla. It's a book about a lot of the industry's reaction to it. So first, if I can ask you, what kind of made you decide to go in that direction? How did this book come to be?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It was a deliberate decision. I think the Tesla story's pretty well known. There's a great book called Power Play that my colleague at the Wall Street Journal, Tim Higgins, wrote a few years ago. I'd recommend anyone check that out for the full unvarnished story on Tesla. And obviously, the book makes clear, Tesla's all over the book. It's impossible to overstate the role that Tesla played the rest of the industry jumping on the EV path, right? And so I looked at this book as, here's what Tesla unleashed, right? This is how Tesla got all of these other big automakers to fall in line and pursue the electric vehicle transition, because clearly climate change, regulatory measures around governments around the world cracking down had a pretty big role. But if it were just that, I think what you continue to see is these compliance cars that we saw in the first 2 decades of this century, that let's jam an electric powertrain in the smallest, dorkiest car we can find. That was the MO of the automakers up until it became clear that Tesla had broken through. And I thought that it was a really interesting story and how the rest of the industry has been scrambling to catch up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's interesting to see the other thing you mentioned in the book is that there's multiple transitions happening at once. It's not a global effort, right? The transition happening in Asia, particularly in China, is very different from what's going on in Europe and the US. And so you have a chapter on Volkswagen. You talk a lot about BYD, what became NIO, some of the Chinese companies now. So as you see it, can you lay it out, like between Europe and the US and China, let's just say, where is the EV transition right now, and how inevitable does it look in each place?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And that says right in the subtitle, messy, right? And this is a big reason why, I think. So in the US, we're seeing a narrow slice of how this whole transition's playing out. And here it's about 10% of new vehicle sales last year were either fully electric or plug-in hybrids. Europe's more like 20 to 25%. And China's approaching 50%. And so I think that's the tension, especially if you're the CEO of Ford or General Motors. You bet big on this 5 years ago, just about every other automaker did. It's not unfolding as quickly as you had expected. I think there was a little bit of forgetting about the consumer in the process here. I think some unrealistic expectations in terms of how quickly enough people would adopt EVs. And so if you're sitting in the CEO chair in Detroit, and you're trying to figure this out, do I lean into this business that's costing me billions of dollars? They're losing billions of dollars on their EV operations right now. And think the impulse is probably, let's pull back on that and continue to sell big pickup trucks and SUVs, because that's what's always paid the bills. And they have to do that because that's helping to fund the transition. But no auto CEO I talk to is pulling back from this. They're slow walking some stuff. They're canceling models here and there. But I think they know that with China at 50% and China becoming this export juggernaut, right? Mostly get cars now, but that's because what's being sold there, the consumers want the electrics. And so the surplus, because there's way too much capacity in China, is mostly internal combustion engine cars going around the world. But there's also EVs, like really credible quality EVs. And I'm sure we can talk more about the China story. So that's the trick right now. I think that's the hardest part about this is how do we calibrate, how do we cadence this rollout of our electric technology to meet the consumer where they're at.
Yeah, it seems the big difference between the West and East at the moment is like, I think lots of auto companies and all the ones you mentioned in the book have a credible EV product on the market. Let's say Ford has the Mach-E, they have the Lightning, GM has all of the formerly known as the Ultium. Now I don't know what we call it, but lots of EVs coming out. They're not going to sell a gas Blazer anymore. Now it's just an EV Blazer. So that's a big deal. And yet they're a long way from what you call the compliance cars, the dorky mobiles, your Ford Focus electric. But at the same time, your book opens with this, right? The Mach-E, from looking at that as an engineering perspective, it's not a great product on the inside. On the outside, people like it. It's fine, right? It competes credibly with the Tesla Model Y, but Ford's at a huge cost disadvantage building it. And ultimately, it's not as flexible of, let's say, as a platform as Tesla or maybe the startups will have, because they can't do as many over-the-air updates. They're tied into other things politically and economically, like their dealer network. It seems like there's a huge amount of like albatrosses hanging around the neck, especially of the US automakers. How do you think that factors into their ongoing struggles?
It's a big part of it, right? That's why Tesla and some of the Chinese startups have been so successful and been able to get the cost down and get to a point where they're profitable. And not, I think there's a couple Chinese EV makers who are profitable. Tesla's profitable. There's not a whole lot else. It's because the batteries are so expensive, but that puts pressure on every other aspect of engineering and design to get as much cost out as possible. And I think a lot of the traditional OEMs started with like a Frankenstein platform of was it internal, parts of it were internal combustion at some point. And so it just wasn't optimized for an EV. That was clearly the case, I think, with the Mach-E, which looks like, it's got a lot of fans. It's a good looking car. It performs well, but yeah, the cost is too high. And that's like a big effort right now of Ford as they work on their next generation of EVs, which is more of a clean sheet redesign. How do we get the cost out so we're not losing? They lost $5 billion on their EV business last year. They're going to lose about the same this year. It's ugly, right? And so that there's a ton of pressure on the traditional automakers to get the cost out. And I think not starting from scratch hurt them, but even companies that GM was more of a sort of clean sheet approach, and they are still at a big cost disadvantage to the Chinese. And China has, it's many factors, right? They've got a big supply chain the minerals and all the stuff that goes into the batteries, just the broader automotive supply chain, obviously labor costs, whatever government support, that's very shadowy. We got to assume that it's much more than what the Western automakers are getting in terms of government help. Mm-hmm. So there's just so many different factors that have given the Chinese, if you look at studies, maybe roughly a 30% advantage on the overall cost of EVs. And that's huge in terms of being able to offer an affordable car that gets adoption going, right?
Yeah, and it's to the extent that, even Tesla, the American darling, like you said, the only company really that can make a profit that's not Chinese right now on EVs is not doing well in that market because their cars at this point are maybe competitive, but they're by no means on the bleeding edge of the technology of a lot of even the cost advantages you're seeing in China. Do you think that the role of Tesla and to a lesser extent the startups between like Rivian and Lucid is still influential for the big Detroit automakers and even Volkswagen in Europe or in Toyota maybe? Or do you think that they're going to look more to the Chinese incumbents or the Chinese players who come out of this profit war they're in right now who emerge as victorious?
Yeah, I think Tesla is still the 800-pound gorilla, and everyone's got to figure out how to compete with them. But to your point, I do think that the focus has shifted to China because I sat down with Jim Farley last year, and he explained to me that look, it's practically game over in China for a lot of the companies that had been big mainstream automakers there. The foreign companies that came in and dominated that market have lost share. That's no secret. Everybody knows that now. And they're not completely pulling out. Ford's figured out a much shrunken down strategy there where they're exporting and they're serving the commercial market and they're actually turning a profit now. But it's a far cry from being a big player in that market. The Chinese have completely taken it over. And so his concern now is we can't let that happen in places like Europe and Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America. So I think a big focus now is we've got to get our costs competitive with the Chinese, however it takes. And one approach Jim Farley's taking is let's get access to the supply chain that the Chinese have. Like, why should we limit ourselves to what we can get from the supply chain in Europe or North America? We should be able to tap into that same supply chain. That's one of the tacks they're taking. But I do think that the Chinese have emerged as I even had a quote in a story from him saying, like, designing and engineering and building to the Chinese standard is like the most important thing for us now going forward, which is really striking to hear from the CEO of Ford, right?
Absolutely. And to the extent the auto industry is not a growth business anymore, yet at the same time, it's still a lot of jobs, both on the engineering of things and especially the manufacturing, the blue collar work that have traditionally actually been well-paying, benefited jobs, right? Sean Fain, of course, got that big win for UAW during last year. And it's something that many people have come to rely on. And yet, if China continues to have success globally and conquest parts of the US, do you think there's any possibility that there's some kind of onshoring of operations? Like, I know Ford has flirted with, for instance, like using CATL batteries and even having a plant in Michigan, and that got diverted, I think, to Mexico and changed somewhat. And the political environment with China is really tense, but do you think there's some kind of basically re-domestication, like the way that, for instance, BMW and Volkswagen are huge employers of American jobs? Do you think that could happen with China one day in the near future?
Oh, so you're asking actual Chinese companies opening factories in the U.S.?
Potential, yeah, like basically lending their technology and manufacturing expertise, like Farley's point, their standards now is setting the world of that kind of reciprocating back to the U.S., like with factories or even with Chinese workers training American workers.
Yeah, we've seen a little bit of that with that CATL Ford plant, right, which is, I believe, under construction now, not open yet. Ford has essentially said, we're using their technology. It's going to be 100% Ford-owned. They've got to be very careful because of the geopolitical tensions around this. And I think that the limiting factor broadly, onshoring for sure, the tariff environment, and I think the computer chip crisis of early in the decade that spooked every auto CEO and who didn't even realize who were making their chips in many cases. They figured out, okay, on key technology like that, batteries as a big example, we need to own that stuff. We need to make it ourselves and we need it in the US. And that's why we have 15 to 20 giant battery factories, either recently opened or under construction across Tennessee and Georgia and Kentucky, creating tens of thousands of jobs, right? Tens of billions, maybe over $100 billion in investment. That's all a reaction to not wanting to be beholden to China and other countries in the world for some of your most important technology. That's all happening. I think that's going to continue to happen. I think that the Trump tariff threats, we'll see how much of that comes to fruition, but I think it's rattled people enough to where we're going to see more of that onshoring. How much more, I don't know. In terms of China, I think Trump has even made a comment like, hey, if a company wants to come and build a factory and employ Americans, I'm all for that investment. I think the tricky part is we've already got, for example, a ban on Chinese-built cars coming into the U.S. because of the software and data privacy concerns, right? How does that work with a Chinese company coming in, building cars that what's going to be in the cars? Is it going to be able to spy on Americans? Like those geopolitical tensions, I think, are going to be tricky when it comes to direct Chinese investment into the U.S.
Yeah, and so maybe there will be some more, like that Ford thing, some more kind of, oh, this is our technology or this is our vehicle still, but we're just using this component or we're using this thing downstream in the supply chain. Maybe that's part of it. The reason that I think it's particularly stark is just as someone who always looks at the bleeding edge, you look at something and you write in the book about the Volkswagen ID.Buzz, for instance, and the passion project that is this long time revival of the famous Volkswagen camper van, which had an opportune moment when Dieselgate happened. The company pivots to electrification, and the Buzz comes out now, and it's well received, but it's an expensive halo product. Meanwhile, like in China, look at something like the Zeekr Mix or other vans, right? Where from every technological point of view possible, including the cost to the consumer, it's a superior product. At the same time, like you can't ignore the fact that in the West here, right, many people have fond memories about Volkswagen and Ford and General Motors and like the pickup trucks, right? The reason those are profitable is because people love those brands. And so I don't think we're all going to be driving Zeekrs tomorrow, but at the same time, like it seems like there's this reckoning coming where if there's such a huge cost disadvantage, do you think people are willing to maybe the brand advantage that traditionally lots of companies in the US and Europe enjoy is fading away?
Yeah, I would characterize the threat of China coming into different markets with what is right now a lower cost, superior product to what most of the Western automakers are and the Japanese are making, is a present threat in Europe. They're moving. BYD's building a factory, I think, in Hungary. I think China now accounts for, I want to say, 20% of EV sales in Europe. So it's happening there. And that just add that to the list of the problems that the European automakers are facing right now, from higher energy costs to, a slowing economy, and all of the European automakers were more dependent on China than a Ford or a GM, and that's fallen apart. Tough times there, and this is another one, is the Chinese coming in. I think the U.S., it's a longer term threat, but I think what people like Jim Farley and others, auto executives I've talked to, nobody feels comfortable with tariffs protecting them from that competition forever. And I think they have a little bit more runway than the Europeans do in terms of getting the cost out and figuring out the kind of technology that people want. But they know that if you have a credible, stylish, affordable EV, people are going to want it. And surveys show that younger consumers are more open to EVs than older. They're also more open to Chinese products. And it's a matter of time. I think the automakers know they've got to figure this out, or China's going to eat their lunch.
Yeah, and that's what makes this so existential, is not just the threat from Tesla, but the threat from China and the global auto market overall. But I think a lot of what you go into the book that's really interesting is also the cultural change at these companies that's necessary for this transition, where you like you have this chapter about the guy who works on combustion power plants at Ford getting, I think, basically the payoff email in 21, and considering that. And it's funny because like you said it early up front, the trucks, the big engines, that's still what makes all the money at Ford, at General Motors, for Mario Barra. And yet the signal they're sending to their employees is, oh, we want people from Silicon Valley, where Jim Farley is going to give Doug Field $10 million a year to develop a Tesla Model 3 type reinvention of the car. And so that's a big cultural shift. And so just from your reporting in general, do you think, to me, that seems like it's going to be a huge talent turnover at the automaker, or at the very least, some kind of massive retraining? How long of a process do you think that is, and how painful do you think that can be?
Yeah. That example on this guy who had worked an engineer, a mechanical engineer, had worked on gas engine development for 30 years at Ford, and by 2021, it was basically all those programs had dried up. Right? It wasn't like there was no work going on in internal combustion, but the focus had shifted so rapidly to electric vehicles that the companies all essentially decided, we're just going to nurse along the gas engines that we have. They're already good. We've worked for a century to refine this technology. We don't need to be making new from scratch gas engines anymore. So this guy was like, okay, this is boring. I don't want to work on electric cars. And it's a much more intricate machine to work on, as to how can I eke out some more fuel economy or refinement out of this gas engine. And so we've probably seen thousands of those types of engineers leave, and they're going to need them for probably a few decades more, right? And internal combustion engines going to be around for a while. But I think now what the car companies are trying to figure out, again, how to calibrate this. They're going to need to do both for a long time. How do we bring in the experts in electrification? But I think the EV stuff, they're figuring out. GM stumbled out of the gate, and they missed 2 or 3 years of the big excitement around EVs. They just couldn't figure out they had manufacturing issues. They were one of the first to say we're going all in on EVs, and then they couldn't get them out the door, and they really fell behind. And now you've seen them fix that. They're now out with a bunch of credible products, and they probably have more models, electric models, than anyone, probably more than they wish they had because there's not enough demand to soak those up. But I think the traditional automakers are going to figure out the EV part of this. I think the bigger challenge is going to be the reason why the Chinese have been so successful. One reason is because they're offering tech in the cars that is better than anything really any other automakers around the world are offering in terms of ease of integration into your life, into your phone, connecting to things in your home. They've just the Chinese consumers expect that. The Chinese have figured out how to rapidly deploy stuff like that. And I think that's the next big challenge for companies like Ford, and Volkswagen's had a lot of problems with its software over the years. I think that's going to be, it's no longer, and it's still an EV race, but I think the next race is the technology that gets infused into these cars. And that's it's a big challenge for the car companies.
No, that's a great point, because it doesn't seem like anyone's figured this out in the US. And the closest, arguably, is Tesla and Rivian, right, with their own really good OSs in the car, and the cars being zonally architected and all of these efficiencies. But at the same time, there's the inevitable reality that, like, in the US, phone brands don't make cars and vice versa. That's the flip opposite in China, right? Apple tried to make a car or some kind of self-driving effort, and lots of the talent from that effort was ex-Tesla, then became ex-Apple, and look at Doug Field, case in point. They're at the automakers now, but neither the tech companies nor the car companies in the US can square the circle here. And yet in China, you have companies that are vertically integrated doing the whole thing.
The Xiaomi story in China, one of the biggest smartphone makers in the world, almost overnight comes out with this product that looks like a Porsche, but sells for about $30,000 and has excellent technology that integrates perfectly into people's lives, and it just gets all kinds of accolades. And it wasn't just like a Halo product. They're selling like, I don't know, like 100,000 of these things, I mean, Apple tries for 15 years and just can never pull the trigger. And it's like this company just emerges overnight. It's just an example of how quickly things are moving in China and how hard it is for the rest of the industry to keep up with that.
Yeah, no, I encourage any listeners of this, if they haven't, look up like the Xiaomi, I think SU7. It's also a credible like Porsche Taycan competitor. And Jim Farley, I think, imported one over for show and tell or testing and couldn't give it up, right? So that's a super threatening product, because it also shows that the Chinese brands aren't just competing on the high technology and those aspects. They're making something that's also a performance vehicle that can compete with a lot of the traditional heritage that American, particularly European brands prize themselves on. And now you're seeing this collapse of even Porsche in China, because their products are really expensive and in many ways inferior to the Chinese products, even if maybe the last 5% of tuning for like having the right brake caliper and those things. Porsche's maybe better, but will a consumer care if it's twice the cost?
Yeah, and if the technology is better in the Xiaomi, even though it's only 95% of the performance, I think the Chinese consumers, they're voting with their wallets, right?
American consumers faced with a similar decision, I think eventually the laws of physics are going to apply there. The last big thing I want to talk about is the manufacturing story and how it's ongoing. You talk in your book about, like, Tennessee, for instance, Ford building a major plant, and General Motors having these plants for both batteries and vehicles in the US, and Rivian's big effort now ongoing in Georgia. And of course, their big manufacturing already in Normal, Illinois. The battery belt in the US has gone from a dream to somewhat of a reality. And the Inflation Reduction Act was definitely a huge accelerant of that. There were tons of funds allocated. And now with the Trump administration, all of a sudden, lots of people in the industry seem to be getting very cold feet. Lots of funds are looking threatened. So I know this is ongoing, and this is obviously not something that you could get into your book in time that you're still reporting on. But what do you see happening right now, and what does it look like for these investments that have been made since 2019 and onwards?
Yeah, I think I don't think there's any question that the Trump administration is hostile to EVs, and it's going to slow things down in the U.S. I don't know if it means that EV sales decline. I think maybe they just go up at a slower rate, because we do have a lot of models coming out. I think there's some things he can do. Almost certainly he's going to roll back EPA and other federal rules that dictate how much fuel economy cars get, how much pollution, carbon emissions. He did that in Trump 1.0. He's on record as saying he wants to do that again. And that's something he has purview over. And he's got to jump through regulatory hoops, and so it could take many months, maybe even a year or two. But those are going to get rolled back. And those are Biden administration rules. And the industry felt like they weren't very realistic or would have required something like half of all new sales to be electric by the early 2030s in order to qualify. And no one really thinks that's happening. So those will get rolled back. I don't know how much. It'll be interesting to see. But the other big bucket of this is direct federal investment for EVs. There's the $7,500 tax credit. That has to go through Congress. All the stuff that's in the IRA has to be decided by Congress. Obviously, Republicans in both chambers. I'm sure there's plenty of GOP lawmakers who would love to dunk on EVs and take away that $7,500 tax credit. It's just an easy, visible thing to take away. Battery money, way more money is allocated to battery production. Something like $150 billion was the most recent estimate, a ton of money that the car companies are very much baking into their calculations for how they get profitable. If they were to yank that battery funding, I think you see some of these huge plants that have gone up or are under construction completely mothballed. That's how big a deal that IRA funding is. And to your point, it's in a bunch of red states. Are those lawmakers really going to want to ice these tens of thousands of jobs that are going into these states? I think that's the biggest question on EV policy right now is what happens to that battery manufacturing. These are tax credits that the companies qualify for, but it's supporting these factories and the people who work in those factories. And I think that you're going to see a lot of the GOP lawmakers look the other way on that.
Yeah, or at the very least, alarms are going to be sounded by people locally, because I think your book has a great chapter on this about the huge impact this has in communities that desperately need that money, right? Federal largesse combined with private investment basically created a new company town in a community that's on the ragged edge. And so for these people, it's really important. And I think they could care less that it's an electric vehicle or it's a battery, which could go into an electric vehicle or any other manner of device. So that's fascinating just from the public end of things, like the consumer, like your point, the tax credit, that's politicized. And yet the manufacturing, the supply side, I don't think lay people really appreciate enough the magnitude of that. I hope your book gets some of that across because, that's a really big message there. Last big thing though, or last thing overall, you said Messi, right, does a lot of work in the book title and the subtitle. And there's been this stalling, not just on Trump end of things, but the consumer side in that story with hybrids and plug-in hybrids, seeing more interest and people not wanting immediately to spend $50,000 on an electric SUVs. Is it maybe not just a matter of stasis and Ford and whoever else keeping their engines alive, but also, let's go back in time and redevelop the Chevy Volt or plug-in hybrid powertrains that we'd abandoned? Do you see any kind of reinvestment going on in technology that maybe we thought we'd left behind?
I think there's no question that relative to expectations from 5 years ago, the internal combustion engine is going to be around longer than people expected then. Hybrids are clearly going to be a bigger part of the story. Plug-in hybrids, still a very small part of the market. If you can get 30 or 40 miles of fully electric driving range before it switches over to gas, those can be somewhat controversial because I think some environmentalists will point out some people don't even plug those in. But I think it all wraps up to increasingly you're going to have people powering their commutes and the way they get around with electrons, whether it's hybrid, plug-in hybrid, fully electric. I think what we've seen in the hybrid story over the last 20, 25 years, I think it's not a perfect analogy to what might happen with fully electric because it doesn't require you to plug anything in. It doesn't require to change anything. But 20 years ago, there was a stigma around driving a Prius, right? And I think today it's just another option in the showroom, and people value not just the fuel economy you get, but a peppier ride. And I just think that normalization factor over time happens with EVs as well. I just think there's a lot of reasons why you're going to see the car makers aren't going to get off the path. China's a big reason. And then for consumers, I just think there's a lot of reasons to think that they continue to embrace, whether it's hybrids or fully electric, it's all on a path to this inevitability of electric power getting us around more than it does now in the future. It's going to be a growing part of the market. Internal combustion, a shrinking part of the market.
Yeah. One more little vignette. People should check it out in your book, the whole Bob Lutz Chevy Volt story, how that kind of bled into what we see today. It's fascinating. So everyone should get a copy of your book. Congratulations on publishing it. Thanks so much for your time today, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
All right, that's all for this week in Directly Current. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another exciting guest. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to Mike for his time. He's, of course, as you can imagine, very busy with the media tour for his book. It is an excellent read, Inevitable, the Messy, Unstoppable Transition to Electric Vehicles. Order it on Amazon, get the audiobook. You can get it wherever you get books. We'll link in the description for you to be able to buy it. And look forward to our next episode. In the meantime, we're doing a lot of things at the American EV Jobs Alliance, so you can check out the link in the show notes there for our statistics, our blog data, and more to come in the ever interesting world of electric vehicles in the United States, where we're undergoing our own political revolution. See you in 2 weeks. I've been Max Patton. Thanks so much for listening.